So it's clear that this year's summit has been a massive success, and just to reiterate what Jill said, thanks very much indeed to everyone for being part of it. Yesterday, on every level, was the most successful day yet for the summit. I'll come back to that theme at the end. But before I do, just to announce our final panel and the speakers on the stage, please. So if you could all join me for the final panel of the day. So before we get into the panel, which is brought to us by Vauxhall Motors, I'd just like to thank James Taylor very much for joining us. And James, over to you for the panel keynote, please.
Thank you, and good to meet everybody this afternoon. Yeah, just a few slides really on Vauxhall and what we've been doing in this electric space, both from a product point of view, but also in terms of just generally trying to raise awareness of infrastructure requirements and trying to make charging easy for everybody so no one's left behind on this transition to electric vehicles. So Vauxhall's commitment is that we want to make sure that everybody has easy access to charging and they feel that charging their electric car is going to be simple and convenient for them. And we've really been pushing on this agenda because personally I think that this charging anxiety is going to be now over the coming years. We've seen a massive acceleration in terms of product range from ourselves and our competitors. We've seen significant increases in ranges. You know, we're now launching cars over 400-mile range. But I think it's really now the charging bit and that convenience part of it, as well as the affordability bit, that's really going to drive consideration for electric cars. Now we've moved through that initial phase, we've got to go into the mass market. And one of the advantages we've got, and it's a fairly unique strategy, is obviously we've got a multi-powertrain strategy, which basically means in every vehicle you can have an ICE solution or you can have an electric solution. And by the end of this year, every single vehicle in our range, be that car or commercial vehicle, will have that electric propulsion option. And again, that's hopefully going to make sure that everybody then, no matter what you want, whether you want a small car, a large car, small van, a large van, everybody's going to have the option to make electric. And because it's familiar, they're familiar products, the infotainment's the same, etc., the boot's the same size, etc., etc. It just makes that transition hopefully a little bit easier for the customer. And then how have we done so far? Well, again, big thank you. I think many of our customers are in the room today. But we've been the leading supplier on electric vans for the last few years. In fact, 1 in 4 vans on the road are Vauxhalls running around. And again, you know, big thank you, because I was certainly passionate about this. I was in fleet sales at the time when electric vehicles were launched and was talking to those customers, and it was a big confidence in Vauxhall, but also the technology, the charging from those companies, many of which bought thousands of vehicles to really make that early leap and then hopefully act as a showcase for other companies to come through. And again, big thank you to those that have supported us with that as well. And it's not just commercial vehicles. In terms of cars, I spoke about our strategy, and that is working. If we look at what we call network sales, so that's retail sales and Motability sales combined, and you may be surprised to know, but Vauxhall are the leading supplier in the whole of the industry this year for passenger cars. And then if you take last year, we're a leading supplier of small car, leading supplier of small SUV with Corsa and Mokka as well. So in terms of what we've been doing, in terms of both the award-winning product, but also in terms of continuing to really push that message out there that you can transition to electric easily with Vauxhall, that is working, no doubt about it. And then if we come on to manufacturing, we announced our first plant globally within Stellantis at Ellesmere Port, purely to build electric vehicles. And again, I think it's probably one of the first plants in Europe to purely build electric vehicles. So that's underway. It's been running a year now, just ramping up now with the passenger vehicle as well. And then next year, we will have electric vehicles in Luton as well. So the Vivaro plant, many of you know, been there a long time. Finally, we're building electric vehicles in Luton as well. So again, from a commitment to the UK point of view, as well as the product range, we're very much committed to electric manufacturing and being a leader within that space in the UK as well. So what have we done in terms of setting ourselves targets? Well, I've spoke to you about, so by the end of this year, we set ourselves a target of having every vehicle in the range electrified. We'll achieve that. We've also set the target of reducing our CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030, so quite an ambitious target. And then as Stellantis overall, we've committed to be net zero by 2038. So that's probably 10 plus years ahead of many of our competitors. And that's why this growth of accessibility to charging is really, really important, because it's great for us to have all those ambitious targets, but if we can't bring customer demand along with us, whether that's in the retail space or the fleet space, we won't be able to deliver on those targets because customers will still be demanding a nice vehicle. So vitally important we address both issues at the same time. And many of you would have seen the Electric Streets campaign that we launched last year. Really, that was all about accelerating the infrastructure, particularly in terms of residential on-street charging. We know that 40% of UK households don't have off-street parking, so domestic tariff isn't available to them. We also know that 80% of charging currently happens at home because it's simple and convenient to do that, as well as cost-effective. So we've really been pushing this on the agenda. We've now got up to about almost 15,000 people have completed the form at electricstreets.co.uk to put their hand up and say, I need electric charging in my street. And then we'll use that data, along with our partner companies' data, to try and then help councils as they access the Levi Fund and develop their local charging infrastructure to really pinpoint where that infrastructure is required. And we're working with a number of key partners, as you can see on the screen. Again, we've worked very much with local councils as well. We've attended a number of events all about training and education to really accelerate this growth of infrastructure, as I say, particularly for that on-street residential charging. We won't get to the mass market adoption of EVs unless we address that issue. So we've done some other research as well. So we did this ahead of the local councils a while ago. 75% of consumers thought the local council should be the driving force in terms of providing electric infrastructure in their local area. So that's quite a big percentage. And there's lots to do, because only 30% thought that they were being supported locally in making that transition to EVs currently. So an awful lot to do. And interestingly, in the recent campaigns, I think only about 25% of local campaigning contains some reference to electric vehicle infrastructure and charging. So vitally important that we all keep this very much on government's agenda, because, again, I'll say it, we won't make the transition unless consumer demand comes with us. We can't force people to have cars they don't want. Also, as you'll know, we're a leading supplier into the Motability market space, and we commissioned some more research a few weeks ago in terms of disabled access to vehicle charging. And just to give you a guide, Motability market will be over 300,000 new vehicles this year. It could even be 350,000. So it's a significant part of the new car market. And only around 2% of chargers are specifically adapted for disabled drivers. And only around about 100 across the whole of UK are in disabled spaces. So this is another important issue in terms of when I said we don't want anyone being left behind with this transition. It's another really important cohort of drivers that we all need to think about as we go through this transition to an electric future. What else have we been doing? Well, as well as pushing that on-street charging through the Electric Streets campaign, we've also partnered with Tesco's. Again, this was all about trying to help customers make the switch, make it feel easy for them. We know that 70% of UK households live within 10 minutes of a Tesco's. They get a year's free charging if they purchase a new VAUXHAll. Again, just trying to make that transition a little bit easier for people to make that first step, as then the whole charging infrastructure catches up around them. So, also on that, again, there'll be further partnerships announced. We're looking at doing points if they buy cars, or you can use points in the showroom, etc. All trying to helpfully, I think somebody mentioned earlier about trying to create this ecosystem, everything working together, trying to think outside the box in terms of solutions going forwards. We've also supported EVI training at Loughborough University. Over 100 councils attended that. Again, that was all about practical charging infrastructure and the rollout. And we're also working with them on some really important research going forwards, which is all around this arbitrary target, 300,000 chargers. Is that the right target? How should it be broken down in terms of local areas? Again, particularly around the Electric Streets campaign and on-street residential charging. So watch out for the results of that in the coming months. And then we've also been heavily in the press. I wrote to Rishi Sunak in The Sun. Some of you may have seen that. I didn't get a reply, surprise, surprise, but we did put that out there. And again, really pushing all the things that need to happen from a central government point of view, in our view, to try and speed up this transition to electric future. And the one bit that I will keep on about is we've got a real disparity today. We've got some huge savings on company car taxation. But obviously, that's heavily skewed towards top-rate taxpayers and premium cars. And yet there's nothing in the private retail space for people buying a smaller family car. And that, intuitively, to me, seems completely wrong. So we will keep pushing on that, and obviously we'll push with the new government that's in place as well to keep these issues very much on the agenda. We know the Levi fund's there, £450 million. Again, Electric Streets, all about trying to help accelerate the access to that, and again, also calling on government to speed up, obviously, access to the grid and permissions, etc., because it's vital now, as the ZEV mandate mandates, probably 3 in 10 cars next year basically have got to be electric. We've got to speed up this rollout of the infrastructure. Today, we don't seem to see major problems in terms of people being able to charge. You read about it every now and then in the press. But as this rapid acceleration of new vehicles onto the road and the vehicle park increases, the infrastructure's got to keep up. We've also joined the Fair Charge campaign to call, obviously, for the 5% VAT to be on public charging as well as domestic charging. And then we've also done our own things in terms of payment parity, which is something that has had some cut through in the marketplace. And that's basically saying it's no more expensive for a customer to transition to an electric car. Your payment per month with the same deposit on 4-year for a petrol car is the same as 5-year on an electric car. Again, we spoke about, I think in the previous panel, about trying to make things easy, and it's all in education. And what we're finding is trying to explain total cost of ownership to retail customers is very difficult. Obviously, in the fleet world, everyone understands, key part of the job. In the retail world, even though your monthly saving could easily be £100 a month on average mileage, it's very difficult to get that message across. So that's why we're saying payment for the car the same, customer, you keep all that benefit. And certainly from, I think, a retailer explaining that to a customer where this is maybe they weren't coming in to buy an electric car originally, that has had some real traction. And I think also probably something else we underestimate, it's really motivated the retailers as well to sell electric cars, because I think it makes that sale of the car a little bit easier for them to explain to the customer. We've also been trying to do our bit in terms of the optical pricing. I think if you read all the research, people feel electric cars are expensive. Again, we significantly reduced the price of the special editions on Corsa and Mokka. You're talking about £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 off the list price. So again, £27,000 for a Corsa, £30,000 for a Mokka. At the time, very much the lowest list price in the market for a 5-door car or a small SUV. Again, all trying to overcome this optical barrier that electric cars are expensive. And then the next product we're going to launch, which is Frontera, and I was hoping I'd announce it today, but unfortunately we've had to put it back a few weeks. But this will be rupture pricing on this car. So in terms of getting an affordable, family-sized CSUV car in electric that's affordable for people, watch this space in a few weeks, because this is going to take the industry to a whole nother level from where payments have been up to now. So when we talk about this transition to electrification, I think OEMs, we're doing our bit, many of our competitors are doing their bit as well. Product range, affordability, I think is being addressed. Big bit now is what can we do on the charging infrastructure, because I think charge anxiety is our biggest issue. So we're doing all we can. The Electric Streets campaign and Tesco's was about trying to help those people that haven't got off-street parking and not access to those low tariffs, to help them come along on the journey with us. But clearly we need all stakeholders to come together to make sure this transition's as smooth as possible and nobody is left behind in this transition to an electric future. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, James. Some really powerful insights there coming from one of the UK's leading OEMs. So straight onto the panel discussion side. We'll run the panel discussion for about 15 minutes, and I'm keen to allow some good time from the audience for such a superlatively good panel. So Chris, if I could come to you first, but first to introduce everyone. So first, Chris Pateman-Jones, who's chairperson of CHARGEUK and also wears the other hat of being the founder of Connected Curb, obviously a partner with VAUXHALL Motors. Jacob Roberts, senior policy and strategy consultant at CENEX. Kim Royds, mobility director at Centrica. So thank you very much indeed for all joining us. Chris, I know in my conversations with Vicky Reid at CHARGEUK, who obviously you work closely with, she told me that the sense of public perception around public charging is that it's around 2 years behind where it actually is in terms of charging in the ground. What's your sense of what's going on there?
Yeah, and firstly, I should apologise. You're all suffering from only having me today and not Vicky. Vicky was here yesterday doing a presentation. I think did a fantastic job following up on the interview she did on the Today programme yesterday morning at 6:20, talking about the report that was released yesterday. But subject to, hopefully I'll do a decent job on this, but I think the point she was making yesterday was that the industry is 2 years ahead of where public perception is. I would say it's actually probably worse. I'm pretty fanatical about EV. My family are probably 2 years behind where the market is actually. I'd say most people are quite a long way behind that. And that is probably exacerbated by the fact that the EV charging market has moved on and made massive strides in the last couple of years. The point that Vicky was trying to get across in her presentations and interviews yesterday was CHARGEUK released a fantastic report which talked about the work that its members are doing and others across the industry are doing. And to the point of keeping up, I'd say the problem that the charging industry has at the moment is actually moving ahead of the EV sales at the moment. I think there's going to be a lag and there's always going to be a degree of tension that takes place within that. But the statistics are pretty clear. In the last year, the EV charging network has grown dramatically. And I think actually the statistics, when we just talk in pure numbers, probably underplays the progress that's been made in terms of the type of charging that's been deployed. And I think equally we get slightly confused in terms of there's a lot of nuance in the charging infrastructure that's out there. As the report tried to get across yesterday, the vast majority of people are charging at home on their driveways. If you have a driveway today, the progress that the rapid and ultra-rapid charging networks have made on motorways and in destination locations means that you can make the switch to EV in almost all parts of the UK now. When you're driving long journeys, there are abundant rapid charging solutions out there, to the point where, I don't know whether anyone else feels the same way, but when I'm on motorway service stations, I'm typically feeling sorry for the CPOs because there aren't enough cars charging in the locations. That isn't the case when you look at the type of charging that Connected Curb does. So if you are relying on parking on public streets, it is still difficult. But there is a massive portion of society that could switch that isn't. And I think that's because of that lag of 2 or maybe more years in terms of where the charging infrastructure might be. But there is huge progress that's been made. If you haven't seen it, the report came out yesterday, and what is even more startling than what's in the report is that the Daily Mail actually wrote 2 positive articles about EV in the last 24 hours, I think, and one of them is about the report itself.
The report, which was announced live here at the EV Summit by Vicky, I'm delighted to say. Kim, so you lead on the consumer side at Centrica, stroke British Gas, stroke Hive. Take your brand pick it as you wish. You've launched Free Charge, which has really offered an incredible incentive for consumers. Can you tell us what that is and how that has incentivized take-up?
Thanks for the introduction, and I was actually going to say something very similar myself that said Hive EV charging is part of Net Zero, part of the Centrica group, and I'm going to talk about British Gas just to add to the confusion. So we launched Free Charge. My colleague spoke about it at the panel, kind of the previous panel as well, October 2023. And basically, it's a year's worth of free driving, or the equivalent of 8,000 miles for drivers. Now, as part of Net Zero Week last week, we announced that we've actually given away 8 million miles of sustainable driving since then, which I think is, quite a a massive number, and I have it on good authority that's the equivalent of driving around the world 321 times, if anyone is interested. But for me, it's not just about the fact that we're giving away free miles. We've talked a lot about over the last 2 days around the ZEV mandate, the barriers to EV adoption. We know that one of the barriers is around, I do not know how much this car is going to cost me to run once I have it, once I get over that initial barrier. So what we've done is we've taken away that initial fear and said, look, we will give it to you for free for that first year. Most of the customers who've taken it today are first-time EV drivers, which is great. And what that means is they can come into the kind of EV ecosystem, they can charge their car, they can use the Hive app, they can understand kind of energy consumption, they can see those credits back on their bill. And by the time, this is the hope, by the time they've reached the kind of that end of that first year, they're well-primed energy experts ready to kind of roll off into whatever is the kind of smart charge tariff or tariff that's right for them. So for me, I'm very proud of the fact that we're trying to take that role and help kind of, drive up that adoption of EV. So successful to date. Watch this space because there's kind of more innovation in that to come from us as well.
Very good. James, lots to unpack in your great presentation. You've obviously really been working hard on the Electric Streets campaign. Can you give us a bit more information on that and how that's unlocking the whole charging infrastructure piece for consumers, please?
Yeah, I think the Electric Streets has been a good umbrella campaign for us to really start to understand some of the wider issues within the space, as well as a manufacturer. As I say, we're up to almost 15,000 form fills now. We've got various other partnerships lined up to share data as well, which will also help councils look at where people are configuring cars and their postcode, but they're not actually buying cars. Is that then got a correlation to that's got a worse EV infrastructure than this area over here? So we'll definitely be working very hard in terms of then trying to educate and help councils with that rollout over the coming period, and again working with our three key partners in terms of just keeping that general drumbeat of awareness and using, I guess, our scale and voice as a big company in the UK to just keep lending our elbow, a shoulder behind it, just to keep that message going. In terms of then how does that translate for us? Certainly, I'd say we're up to about, I think we measure it in the early 20s in terms of national awareness of the campaign. So it's a standalone kind of one-man band, one brand campaign that I would say is quite good. Certainly gets a lot of endorsements within the industry as well, and it's had a lot of, I guess, retweeting, etc. whenever we've put anything out, which has been really positive. And I think in terms of what we can see just from people coming onto our websites for configurations, if you compare to a year ago, we were probably at only 5%. It was in the real downtime of every Daily Mail article was a negative EV story. Price of electric had gone up, everyone was anti-EV. That's now probably running about 25% configuration mix. So as I say, we're kind of broadly on track with the ZEV mandate, but clearly every year that's got to go up, and we've got to get, as I keep saying, more to this mass market customer to make them feel happy that it, and I think I probably say convenient more than anything else. I think in terms of affordability, the cars are now as affordable as ICE. In fact, then if you look at total cost of ownership, they'll be much cheaper. So it's less about, I think, the cost of charging per se within that wider cost. It's more about, somebody mentioned on the previous panel, a lifestyle. It's more is, can I keep charging my car without it being a massive inconvenience in my life? And that's the bit, I think, by having on-street residential charging, use that analogy of a post box. I know I've got one around the corner. If I need one, I can go and use it. That's where I think we've got to get to if we're going to get to that big cohort of the mass market, rather than people who have just got a particular interest in either environmental issues or particular interest in technology or particular interest in electric vehicles. Yeah,
I talk about the early adopters were people that actually liked to challenge. They quite liked complexity. People like us in this room, the early mainstream, the complete opposite. They want everything to be absolutely as simple as possible and for there to be zero complexity. Thanks. I really appreciate the work you're doing on the Electric Streets campaign. I think it's a great campaign. Jacob, CENEX recently conducted some research on the disparity in charging infrastructure across different local authority areas. Can you tell us a little bit more about that research, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, real pleasure to be here today. It's been such a good day. I've spoken to so many people that I've known the industry for a little while, and it's been a great event. So well done, Aid and your team for putting this on, and thank you, James, for sponsoring this panel as well. It's a real pleasure to be part of this. In terms of our research, more recently working in partnership with James and his team at VAUXHAll, we basically asked the fundamental question, which is how do we know we're doing this right? How do we know we're doing this well? There's some fairly arbitrary numbers that are thrown around when it comes to progress in the sphere of public electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Most of those metrics are flawed in one way or another. Having just a blanket number of charge points, 300,000 charge points by 2030. Even if you delve one layer below in the detail of that sort of government ambition, we have that range of 280 to 720,000 charge points. So already that number is kind of not really doing its job. We have various different estimates that have wildly different numbers. And so setting a course for this industry is quite challenging from a national level. As an organization, CENEX wants to try and dispel some of this uncertainty and address some of these complexities in the way that we measure and monitor progress. And so really pleased to have been working with James's team on a project looking at that specific topic. So to give you a sneak peek of some of the findings, the report will be launched later this year. But we've done some really good work that's been contributed to by Chris and by others within industry to try and identify what does a good metric actually look like. And we've come down to it being actionable, scalable, measurable, and relevant, which sounds like buzzwords. But actually, when you look at the metrics we're currently using and compare them against those 4 indices, none of them tick all those boxes. So we need to do something different. And one of the really interesting things we've found from our research is no one metric, no one way of measuring progress in this industry works for all of the different types of charging infrastructure. So you can't measure progress in delivering on-street residential charging infrastructure in the same way that you'd measure progress in delivering charging infrastructure ultra-rapid down the strategic road network, because you're aiming to deliver fundamentally different services to different people with different requirements. And so one of the key findings of the report is actually, from a strategic level, if we're going to determine how well we're doing, how much progress we're making, we need to look at different metrics for different sectors of the market. And there's been some really interesting findings of that, which I can't wait for that report to be published.
Give us a few insights, Jacob. Go on.
Well.
Spill a few beans.
What I can tell you, without getting into too much of the specifics, my personal favorite takeaway of this research exercise. So in the on-street charging sphere, so on-street residential charging, we determined that an ideal metric takes into account how close the charging infrastructure is to where people live. So we express that in terms of the distance walking, so walking time to the nearest charge point, but also how many charge points there actually are. So you could have a neighborhood, particularly in somewhere like London or a big city, where you have 100 people living within 2 minutes walk of a single charge point. So on one side, that looks great because they don't have to go that far for that charge point. On the other side, it looks bad because that's 100 people fighting over a single charge point, which is why having those 2 indices is really important. How close is the charge point and how many charge points are there? And having done that analysis across all of the local authorities in the UK, the really interesting findings are that most of the London boroughs are literally years ahead in terms of matching supply and demand. They are years ahead with the amount of supply of infrastructure versus the actual demand for infrastructure in London, whereas the majority of local authorities in England, Wales and Scotland are 1 or 2 years behind, with a few lagging way back and a few that are sort of in the middle. There's a very good diagram which is going to get released in the study, which will open a few eyes on that topic.
An aggregate 7-year difference between London and outside London.
Absolutely.
Right, amazing.
I just think that's a really weird outcome, right? Because when you look at commuting distances, people don't drive by car to commute in London. So it's very strange that London boroughs are so far ahead in that, because, and equally from a CPO's perspective, it's literally from a utilisation perspective one of the worst places you could go, because no one's charging, because they're charging or they're only needing to charge their car once every few weeks. By contrast, when you go to some of the outer boroughs where people have less positive transport experiences, it's just a very strange outcome that we've got there.
No, indeed.
I also just thought on the metrics that you're using, that might also be a way that we should be measuring car sales, because when we look at a macro level across the UK, it doesn't really reflect, again, the nuances between the charging infrastructure. So on the street, you will have pockets where the provision is really good, and really we should be looking at, so are people then switching in those locations? Whereas when you look nationwide, Levi hasn't even really launched yet. the networks haven't been deployed properly yet. So I think starting to look at a nuanced, localized level, and then also targeting marketing campaigns in those places as well. So for big OEMs, you don't want to be spending money on a nationwide campaign to try and get people who park on street to switch. Really, you want to be focusing that and aligning your marketing spend and the targeting to where charging infrastructure is going out at scale.
You may have given a good answer to the next question, which I'll ask of everybody, actually. Let me go around the panel with the same question, then I'll open up to questions from the audience. So what next to make the early mainstream transition earlier? Chris, over to you for that one.
I've touched on it. I think I'm really excited to see what's going to happen with Levi in the next few years. I think there's a lot of progress to be made in the one area of EV charging, which has really been very difficult to tackle. I think I want to see more collaboration, and I would say this obviously here being that I'm representing CHARGEUK, but I think when I speak to journalists, one of the challenges they've had in writing positive EV stories has been the car industry has a really good body representing it, where journalists know they can go to the SMMT and they can get information, they can get a voice consistently and coherently. The charging industry hasn't necessarily had that, and so I'm really proud of the fact that CHARGEUK was set up last year and is now, from yesterday, first proper instance where it came out with some real positive and an alternative narrative, or maybe some clarity on the way that we see EV charging infrastructure. And so I hope that you'll start to see some more progress on that, so that maybe we start to reduce the lag between the reality and what people anticipate.
Yeah, I'd be keen to help you get journalists to go to CHARGEUK as their first port of call for information. Nice plan.
My open request to everyone is to do that.
Very good. Kim.
I mean, I'm going to keep it very like domestic charging focused. But I think we spend a lot of time talking about how convenient and easy, at-home charging is. A piece of research we did recently, and talking about that kind of next wave of EV drivers, is they are less tolerant. Their expectations need to be met more consistently. They're less okay with kind of jump blips in the road. Connectivity for me is one of those issues. We talked at this morning's kind of panel, the Connect panel talked about the 99% uptime in public charging. But actually there's this wave of requirements coming through for at-home charging to have the same level of uptime. And for a small percentage of our own customers, they're really impacted by that. So I think for me, it's like getting that experience consistent for every type of driver. And we've got our own challenges within domestic charging. We're not kind of without, it's not we all sail off into the sun because we have a driveway and we can charge. So yeah, that for me is something very kind of poignant that I think we're spending a lot of time focusing on at the moment.
Very good. Jacob, what next to make the early mainstream transition easier?
I'm going to use a topical football analogy, if you don't mind. So I feel like what we've done in the EV charging sector and the EV space in the UK is we've assembled a team of world-class players. And what we absolutely need to do now is allow them to play the game in the way that they're really geared up to play. What we don't want to do is park the bus. This all seems quite familiar and maybe a little bit of a sore topic for a few people in the room. But I think there's a real opportunity to get a bit more specific about this. There's a real opportunity with a new government coming in now to dispel any of the uncertainty about the direction of travel. I think, without wanting to be too critical, or maybe wanting to be critical, I think the previous government did quite a lot of damage to consumer perceptions of EVs with a number of very, very high-profile announcements that were quite counterproductive to the interests of this sector. But also just a general rhetoric that I think, if nothing else, introduced doubt in the direction of travel from ICE to ultimately electrified mobility. I think with a new government coming in, like I said, we've got a world-class team on the pitch. That new government can come in and get them to play in the way that they want to play. And I'd love to see the Labour government now coming out and really putting some weight behind electric vehicles.
But mostly we don't need to put Gareth Southgate in charge of CHARGEUK, right? So, yeah. James, over to you.
Yeah, I think the point on Rishi Sunak's move of the ban from 2030 to 35, I mean, we saw that had a bigger impact on lead mix than the removal of the plug-in car grant. So if Keir Starmer's true to his word and he puts it back to 2030, I think that probably is one of the single actions that could make the biggest difference. I think that could well be it. Levi fund's obviously key. I think people need that confidence to see that their local infrastructure is there. We saw the research details that I said earlier. And then probably a final part is a bit of a tangent, which is something that maybe we don't think about enough as an industry. I know some manufacturers are doing more in this space than others, is the retailers have got, for the private market, have got a key role because they are the person between the customer and their decision. Obviously, in the salary sacrifice world, you've got a website, you pick your car, you steer down to an electric car, aren't you? So you just choose what you want to pay, off you go. In the world where you've got the retailer in between, that retailer can have a significant impact on what that customer finally ends up purchasing. And I think maybe, personally, I've probably underestimated that a little bit over the last few years. And I think we can see now, as our network becomes more and more confident talking about electric vehicles, talking about different charging tariffs, talking about on-street, talking about public charging, utilising ZapMap, et cetera, to try and help that sales process. Don't underestimate, I'd say, the role of the retailer in terms of getting that person in the middle of the market who could go either way to convince them to buy an electric vehicle by explaining the benefits that possibly when they see in the press, they perhaps see a little bit more of a negative view on electric vehicles than what the reality is.
Yeah. Perhaps one for our friends at Auto Trader to ensure that no driver is left behind. And no problem at all with ensuring politicians don't change their minds or their commitments. That's that problem solved. So I'll just open up now for the last few minutes to questions from the audience. Any questions from the audience? Please raise your hand, say who you are and where your question, who you work with, and obviously your question. Thanks a lot. Gentleman in the middle, blue shirt.
Yeah, it's Dave Watts from MEN Trucks again, sorry. We know that the majority of EVs, the registered owner is a business, whether it's a lease co or a business owning its own vehicles. Therefore, we don't really know what the demographics are of EV uptake is. So if we're saying that local infrastructure is a key part to changing the behaviour, how do we know how to roll out the local infrastructure?
Who's that question particularly addressed to?
Anybody?
Who would like to say that? Jacob.
But Jacob's hand up.
It probably won't answer the question entirely, but this is something within CENEX's role within the Levi support body. We've had to grapple with this question in that you have DFT registration numbers that in some cases, mostly looking at Slough and Solihull, the numbers are ridiculously higher for like EV registrations than what are actually on the road. And local authorities are trying to make decisions based on those numbers. So we've been making efforts to provide statistics that are a little bit more true to life. The approach that we've taken is actually using a combination of data from Experian and data using MOT. And both of those are calibrated at a local level, so they represent the vehicles that are actually being driven. It's not necessarily fully answering the question about commercial vehicles, I appreciate, but in terms of leased vehicles, yeah, we're doing what we can through the Levi support body to make sure local authorities have some visibility of the actual number of EVs and not just the number of EVs registered.
Chris, yeah.
For me, this comes down to the commercial contracts that you're putting in place. So if you get the contracts right, no one should be deploying for the EVs that are on the road today. They should be deploying for what is needed within the communities that you're trying to serve. And if you have good long-term contracts in place, you can incentivize CPOs to be deploying infrastructure, recognizing the lag that you have. So for my business, if I go and deploy on a public street, typically no one has an EV on that street because they're not going to buy the EV until they know they can charge in a location. What we have to try and do is to try and focus on the marketing and the communication in the consultation phase before you put charging points out to try and reduce that lag as far as possible. But when you look at the demographics in an area and you can look at the commuting distances in those areas, parking availability, number of people who park on street, you should be able to work out within range the number of charging points that you need. The key point is you need to be able to give the CPO confidence that they're going to have enough time to earn that investment back. So I see still quite often contracts that are too short to allow you to be able to earn that investment back without stiffing the customer. So you have to try and get a long-term contract in place. Otherwise, you're going to see charging tariffs being extremely high. And if already as CHARGEUK and many of our members are getting pressure on why are tariffs expensive, long-term contracts allow you to keep tariffs lower.
Thanks. Another question from the audience. Raise your hand, please. If you could say who you are and who you work for, please.
Sarah MacArthur, of Arval UK-ish. So salary sacrifice and company car has made a huge trajectory in the adoption of EV. What are the panel's thoughts with a new government on a salary sacrifice / company car scheme which is open to all? So it's not just down to a select group of leasecos or employers who have the capability to offer an arrangement like that. What would you guys think that would do? And you know, if we're calling to government to do something different, what about that? Similar to nest pensions and automatic enrolment years ago.
James, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think it's probably a good idea in general. I think we've got this imbalance today, haven't we, as you mentioned, where it's really a select cohort of individuals that are benefiting from it. And we need to widen that out, I think, to make... I think it doesn't have to be a significant gesture even. I think a gesture by government for the private motorist to say, here's £1,000. If there's just some indication to say you're getting something, there's something in it for you to make the switch, I think that little nudge would make a lot of difference. So whether it's through salary sacrifice or whether it's through some sort of plug-in car grant, whether it's through a reduction in VAT from 20 to 15% or 20 to 10%, I think there's various things government can do. My personal view is today some of the company car benefits are too high, and some of that money that government is losing, they could effectively reinvest some of that into the other parts of the market to better balance things up.
Perhaps some means testing as well for drivers who are not necessarily the wealthiest, another thing to consider. Listen, thanks very much, everyone, for the questions, and thanks very much indeed to the panellists and, of course, to Vauxhall Motors and to you, James, for sponsoring that panel. All super interesting. So I'll just make a few closing remarks, and then there's the networking with 2 amazing free prizes, a VIP guest passes to the London EPRI and an electric Brompton. But thanks now to the panel, and I'll just make a few closing remarks. Thank you very much indeed.